City Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Gilad Avrahami. I'm the Programs and Development Coordinator here at hmTV. This podcast is a production of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. On today's episode of The Past Has an Afterlife on hmTV, my special guest, Trevor Stern, will join me for a conversation about Jewish student life today. Trevor, I would love to hear from you about not just the college that we shared. We met each other at Haverford in Philadelphia, but also your experiences in two other universities since then, because you went on to pursue two master's degrees at Oxford and a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And the things you're studying are also worth talking about for another time. But just for now, could you start with Haverford? And when you were going into your undergraduate degree, what had you been hoping to get out of Jewish student life there? What were you coming in with? What did you find there? And how did you find it?
So, to be quite honest with you, and I don't think I've even necessarily articulated this before, I don't think I went into undergrad anticipating being a part of Jewish student life more than anything else. It was, one of many things I was interested in. I felt connected to Judaism, certainly, but I definitely did not anticipate being as closely connected to it as I was. I probably thought, I would go there to celebrate the holidays, that I would go to the occasional Shabbat, and maybe use that as a place to meet other Jews, to meet people. But I think I didn't have a conception then of how important it would come to be in my undergrad experience, in my life writ large. Since then, that was kind of surprising to me.
Right. So what sorts of organizations did they have there? Were they student organizations? Were there programs? Was it connected to your studies? Was it not connected to your studies?
Sure. So my involvement when it came to Haverford was mostly centered on the Chabad house on campus, which was run by an absolutely wonderful couple, Ellie and Bloomy Gervitz. They were fantastic, really did everything they could to make Jewish students on campus feel welcome, arranged activities throughout the week, for every holiday, for every Shabbat. That really did end up being my involvement with Jewish life on campus. Now, I wasn't necessarily looking to get involved in an organization that was run by, an Orthodox group. It kind of just came about because of how it was structured at Haverford. They had Chabad and they had a Jewish student union. Now, the Jewish student union was very secular in outlook. They had the occasional Shabbat dinner. They would order non-kosher food. They had actually disassociated from Hillel because of Hillel's Zionist views, to give you an idea where they were politically. Now, when I got to campus, I didn't really have an idea one way or another which group I would be a part of. In fact, I think I even had, initially, I kind of figured I would be more involved in something like the Jewish Student Union. But it became apparent to me that there was kind of this social divide between the two groups. And in effect, people who went to Haverford who cared about Judaism beyond, the occasional thing, people who wanted to go to Shabbat, people who wanted to celebrate the holidays, even when they weren't Orthodox, and there weren't many Orthodox Jews at Haverford. I think there was one. They all went to Chabad. That's where I ended up going. That's where you ended up going as well. I think that's where most people who grew up as conservative Jews ended up going. Even though it didn't necessarily religiously align with us, it felt much more comfortable in terms of a place that thought about Judaism in a similar way to us. Partially because there were students, who weren't necessarily as religious there, but just cared about Jewish life and Jewish tradition.
Right. Well, I think it's notable that they made an effort to have different kinds of programming that could be available for Jews of different amounts of religious observance, even for non-Jews. I know that almost every single Shabbat dinner we ever went to there was not just open to non-Jews, but was often frequented by them. And it was a chance for people who didn't know much about Judaism to discover it, to explore it, to learn a little bit about it, to come into contact with people for whom it's a big part of their life. And
I mean, we had, every term we made sure to have a Shabbat 100. That the idea, Haverford's a small school. It had like 1,400 people. We made sure to have this Shabbat when we tried to bring as many people as we possibly could, tried to get up to 100. I think we hit it a couple times, got close quite often. There was also other outreach programs like the Stories That Live program, which I participated in, which connected students, both Jewish and non-Jewish, to Holocaust survivors. The idea being that you learn about their stories and then you present it in a very public format to the campus community and the broader community.
Right. Now, we were there at the same time, and a lot of things happened in the world around the time that we were at college. We were there from 2018 to 2022. And it was also a moment when the progressive movement was, I think, I don't know if it was at its peak, but that it was something that was very strong on campus that we were coming into contact with. And I know that there were experiences, whether connected to that or not, that affected the feeling of home that college offered. And Chabad, in some sense, for me, I know was a sort of home because it was a refuge and a place where being Jewish was not a problem, not even a question. But can you talk a little bit about the sorts of experiences that you witnessed, that you faced directly when you were at college, that set the environment at Chabad apart from the environment on other parts of campus?
Sure. So I would say Haverford, when we were there, was a very fraught place. Like you said, a lot of events happened while we were there. Very early on in my experience, I got the sense that people who thought differently, even in small ways, were not necessarily welcome on campus. I mean, forget about conservative students, those who were liberal, but like myself, but didn't feel comfortable with all of the rhetoric being thrown around or all of the strategies being employed, ended up feeling very alienated by the environment at Haverford. In terms of the applicability to something like Judaism, there was really this racial consciousness when it came to campus that oftentimes extended into what I would call intolerance against different groups, and often intolerance against Jews. I mean, an example that comes to mind right off the bat was my very first year at Haverford. I was part of the Stories That Live program, which I talked about previously, had made this presentation about a Holocaust survivor. And the student council decided to have this event called We Speak on the same day. We Speak is essentially something where people of color talk about their experiences on Haverford's campus, discrimination they faced, and they're the only ones who are allowed to speak. They planned this event. Actually, they did slightly move it because there was a cancer run that morning, and they were very willing to move it for the cancer run. When we came to them, because we'd actually planned to have Stories That Live that same day.
Way before they had.
Mm-hmm. They refused to move it. And I remember, I mean, to be quite honest with you, I actually had a bit of a mental breakdown that morning when I was getting ready to go to Stories That Live. While I was in the shower getting ready, I remember just crying and crying. Because this was also a time that was very difficult for Jewish Americans. This was just after the Pittsburgh shooting. This is when violent anti-Semitism felt very rampant in the U.S. And what we had was an event that specifically, because the majority of Jews on Haverford's campus, like the Jews in America, would be classified as white according to the racial definitions that people there employed. and would not be able to speak at an event like we speak. So to have this event at the same time as they were having the Stories That Live program, and essentially that the survivors who were coming to this event would not be able to speak at a place like we speak, and almost was supplanting their voices and not honoring what they had been through by pushing this narrative. And I saw this elsewhere at college, this narrative that Jews don't face discrimination, that anti-Semitism isn't important. That's something we've seen quite a bit since October 7th. But this was like the early kernels of it, this idea that that they didn't care about the Holocaust. I think I even had someone in my first week at Haverford specifically say to me, oh, the Holocaust was a long time ago. And I think this was the prevailing view on campus, that people didn't care, that they saw a discrimination in this very specific lens around identities that they cared about while not caring about other identities, and having this oftentimes seemingly purposeful blind spot towards anti-Semitism as a form of discrimination.
Now, the last time you came on the program, we spoke about collective memory.
Yes.
And I think what you're describing speaks to a certain form of collective memory that at the very least existed on our campus about which historical events are important and which aren't, because at the same time as people were saying the Holocaust was a long time ago, there were other historical events, usually specifically in American history. People prioritized those, but of discriminated against groups in the U.S. But from the time of the Holocaust, or much before the Holocaust as well, the legacy of slavery, that these were big topics and that people really wanted to talk about that. And so people weren't being removed from history entirely, but they had certain parts of history that were very salient for them, that spoke to them or spoke to at least a group of people who was defining the collective memory on campus. And the Holocaust wasn't one of those things. And why do you think that is? Where do you think that came in to your experience?
Sure. So I think one thing that you see increasingly in American discourse and bleeding onto campus is this idea of Jewish racial identity. Now, Jews are in the unenviable position that to white supremacists, far-right activists, we are not white. We're racially inferior. They have largely kept with the racial definition of Jews that has been around since the eugenics movement started, that was adopted by Adolf Hitler during the Holocaust. At the same time, we've seen this shift in left-wing circles, that Jews are seen within this American racial paradigm, that we're seen as completely white, privileged, undiscriminated against. And it almost puts us in this vice that we're being squeezed by both sides, both being claimed to be non-white for those who that identity would be grounds for oppressing us, and also claimed as white by those who would use that to dismiss anti-Semitism and not take it seriously, and oftentimes even be anti-Semitic themselves. I think it puts us in this unenviable position. I definitely saw that on campus in terms of people not taking Jewish concerns seriously. I mean, I had many conversations with administration, one of which ended, we were trying to bring Dara Horn, the author, the
People of Dead Jews.
Exactly, exactly. Very interesting title. But we were trying to bring her to campus for a conversation, and they were initially going to offer us several $100s in funding for this conversation through a pot of money from the Center of Peace and Global Citizenship that was directed at the Middle East. Now, a lot of what Dara Horn talked about in her book was about Israel, Jews in the Middle East, and Jews of recent Middle East ancestry from the Arab world. But that wasn't enough for them. I was the one who applied for the grant, and I got an email back that said this wasn't quite what they were looking for. And you got this sense, which has since gained some credence with recent allegations against Haverford, them being put before Congress for the rampant anti-Semitism on campus. That, to borrow an expression from a Jewish book in the UK, Jews don't count. we're not oppressed in the way other people are, and therefore we're not recognized. We're not privy to this funding. We're not privy to this recognition that other groups on campus clearly were.
Now, personally, I haven't had a lot of exposure to those sorts of experiences. I sat through a lot of those with you at Haverford, but mostly I've been in the U.S. and experienced my interactions with people and being a Jew and seeing how other people around me talk to me about those sorts of things, but in the U.S. And you have now spent, I think, over 3 years at this point in the United Kingdom, where you've done your continued your studies.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about first how you continued to participate in Jewish life there, or even in cases where you weren't a part of Jewish life, how that was a part of your life, and take us away also with some of the negative experiences or the other experiences that came out of that.
Sure. So I moved to the UK in late 2022 after we graduated from Haverford. I've been there for the last 3 odd years. I became very involved in the Jewish Society there. I ended up becoming the president of the Oxford Jewish Society during my master's degree over the period that included October 7th. It was at the very start of our term. Simchat Torah was our first big event. And yes, I kind of felt like I was thrown into the deep end. There was a lot of tension on campus. I ended up writing an article for The Times in London about what was happening on campus and in the UK writ large. In a lot of ways, it mirrored what happened in the US with maybe a slight delay. A lot of the campus protests in the US preceded those in the UK. The ones in the UK really kicked off more in the spring. But despite not having campus protests, you did see a lot of hatred directed at us as the local Jewish community. Many hate crimes carried out. I remember probably the worst that I faced was in the winter just around Hanukkah. I was walking to a Hanukkah party with a tinsel Star of David. And this was around 10 at night, and this guy walked past me in the street staring, and then he just spit at me and walked away. And it was very clear why he was spitting at me. These are the kinds of things people were facing in the UK at the time, and it was really hard leading the Jewish community there, partially because we were an apolitical society and how to walk a fine line of addressing anti-Semitism. That was always my chief goal, while also not being too overtly Zionist. That was something that, although I'd say 90% of us in the group were Zionist, we thought was very important from the beginning of the Jewish Society. It had been around long before I was there, this idea that it protected the Jewish Society from moments exactly like this. Now, that protection wasn't perfect, but I think it did help us keep us out of the crossfire to a certain extent. And there were those who thought that I should break that traditional neutrality. And that ended up leading to quite a bit of conflict within the society itself, which ended up wearing down on me. So it was both people outside who oftentimes were telling me that I was going too far, that I was, that they were upset with the way I was calling out anti-Semitism, and specifically anti-Semitism in these pro-Palestinian protests, and were going after me for that, and people within the society who felt like I wasn't going far enough. So I really felt like I was walking quite a fine line there.
Do you think, I know that was the position of the society you were part of, and that had already been the case when you got there.
Yes.
But do you see the role of Jewish student groups as ideally being apolitical? Do you think that's an important thing? Does it depend on the kind of society it is? Could you have a bigger one that is apolitical and then smaller ones that are more political?
That's a good question. And I mean, at Oxford, we had an Israel Society that was overtly political, and I think those are very positive spaces. I think it's good to have organizations that can speak out specifically about Israel, about Zionism. I do think as Jewish societies, we have responsibility in a couple ways to keep ourselves apolitical. One is the sense that you need to be able to welcome all Jewish students. And in the US, much more so than in the UK, there are many young Jews who aren't Zionist, but it does exist in the UK as well. And having a place where they felt open to come was important to me. But even bigger than that, I think, was this idea of preserving Jewish life aside from current political happenings. That we've been a tradition for thousands of years. We're celebrating the holidays, we're marking them, and being a place where people can do that. I think there's a big important role for Israel advocacy. I just saw it as separate from our mission as a Jewish society, and also helped with us being taken seriously by administration. And when we did call out anti-Semitism in these pro-Palestine movements, of which there was tons and tons to call out, but for us to be taken seriously and not called a Zionist mouthpiece, being able to advocate for Jews as Jews on these college campuses and point out the ways that they were being targeted.
Now, after you were at Oxford, I think at this point, over a year ago, you started your PhD in the University of Edinburgh.
Yes.
Was that significantly different from Oxford? What have you been involved in there? And now that you've been in these three different places, how do you see the Jewish communities in those places differing? Is it based on where people are from? Is it based on what the priorities in those areas are?
Sure. So since I've gone to Edinburgh, I've been involved both with the Jewish Society there and the Chabad. I've decided to take a bit more of a back seat. I was president of the Jewish Society both at Haverford and at Oxford. For one, I'm getting older and I'm less the same age as the students involved. And for another thing, I think particularly after Oxford, I was kind of tired of all this. It took so much effort and so much energy and so much commitment that I decided to take a bit of a step back. From what I hear, things at Edinburgh were much worse during my time at Oxford. When I was at Oxford, they were worse there. This was when the campus protests were at their height in the UK. Though we've seen quite a bit of disturbing rhetoric in Edinburgh recently, things like student groups putting up signs calling for intifada, to give one example that's been quite bad. The Jewish Society has been the target of anti-Semitism. Once I remember we were doing a pub quiz at a pub. This woman heard, this is the Edinburgh Jewish Society. We're having a pub quiz. She slammed down her glass, yelled "Free Palestine," and marched out. There very much is this anti-Semitic attitude at Edinburgh.
What was remarkable about that one is it was just that the Jewish Society was having pub quizzes, bar trivia, by the way, for those who...
Yes, sorry. My British terminology has become too entrenched.
I guess so. I've pointed that out a couple of times. I think this is one of those. So, but I know it by now, so sometimes I don't even think about it. Pub quiz is automatic for me.
Yes, but it had absolutely nothing to do with Israel.
Right.
Absolutely nothing. That connection was all, which is why I think it's important to point out incidents like that. Because a lot of times these pro-Palestinian activists don't draw a division between Zionists and Jews or Israelis and Jews. And they'll very overtly target. I mean, you saw this in the UK in Manchester with the horrible synagogue shooting that happened, just a couple months ago. That people can't draw this distinction, and Jews in the diaspora are increasingly put in the crosshairs. But to answer the second part of your question about differences between Jewish communities in the US and UK, the US is much more decentralized. Yes, the Jewish center of the United States has long been New York City. There are a lot of Jews in New York and its suburbs, but we have large Jewish communities elsewhere. We have huge communities in Florida and Chicago and in California, even in cities in the middle of the Midwest, like Cleveland, where I grew up, had, a historical Jewish community. The UK is much more centralized. Yes, there are Jewish communities in small cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow, or there is a sizable community in Manchester. But the London community very much dominates Jewish life in the UK. And that's something I've noticed while I've been there, is even breaking into Jewish communities there is much more difficult if you're outside of those it's in Northwest London, but that Northwest London circle, most Jews at my university, most involved Jews do come from there, and Jews from elsewhere in the UK/foreign Jews always kind of feel like outsiders. And that's something, aside from addressing anti-Semitism, that I saw as central to my mission at Oxford, was bridging those divides, getting Jews from outside of London more involved in Jewish life. Because I think even for us in the diaspora today, when we think about Jewish continuity, it's not just about those large communities. I think that's oftentimes where it's very easy to have Jews continue to feel Jewish and continue to preserve traditions. It's about outreach to people in different communities who maybe, like me, didn't grow up with, a large, Jewish community, or even those who didn't grow up going to synagogue. And I think that's something that I've seen as more difficult in the UK than I've seen definitely at Haverford, where I felt like it was much easier for those people to break in and get involved. It's much more difficult in the UK to crack into those social circles.
Right, and I suppose that could be the case in other countries as well, or other places where there is a much smaller community. And we know that there are students from around the world who attend universities abroad, who study abroad, who are hoping to find a form of Jewish community there, to have the holidays, even if they're just there for a semester, and that they might encounter that as well. I was just going to ask as a final question, what advice do you have for people who are entering college, who grew up Jewish, who would like to find a Jewish community in college, or are trying to figure out their connection to Judaism, and what your experience has told you about that?
Sure. Wow, that's a big question. One of which is, I would say to people who are choosing which college to go to, from someone who maybe didn't make the right choice, to be very careful about where you go to college. I think it's very difficult to gauge when you're going in what the environment will be like. But I think not to underestimate, even if you are not that religious, not that connected Jewishly, the extent to which both the existence of Jewish life on your campus / the activism going on might end up affecting you. I think a lot of people underestimate it. I've seen a lot of people who were stunned and ended up actually coming to Jewish communities in the wake of having these negative interactions and not being sure where to turn. So to think about that, I would also say not to be afraid to approach Jewish communities. For me, as in my undergrad experience and after, largely people are open and welcome and happy to have fellow Jews come and participate. If you end up finding a community that doesn't work like that, it does happen. There are oftentimes many different communities at college campus, not to be put off, but also not to be afraid. I think a lot of people feel intimidated going in, not knowing anyone. They feel that they're not Jewish enough. Maybe they only have one Jewish parent. Maybe they didn't grow up going to synagogue. That they feel like people will judge them. And largely, I think that isn't true. I think people are accepting. And I think giving it a shot and seeing if it works for you. It won't work for everyone, but I know for me, it led to a lot of social connections. And also using the Jewish community to lean on. I think especially right now, there are things that it's very hard to get support from other sectors. A lot of people have friends who might see Israel differently from them, or might see Judaism differently from them, and can leave people in very uncomfortable situations. And not to feel afraid to go to your local Jewish communities to vent, to express, to try to come to terms with this. I feel that for me and for a lot of people, it's been a place that allows that much more so than wider social circles at college. So I would say get involved. If you're thinking about it, take the plunge. It's really great.
Great. Well, thank you. You heard it from Trevor. And that means that it's really worth considering, just like everything else we've talked about today, I think. So thank you so much again.
Yeah. Thank you for having me again. It was really fun.
Great. Well, thank you for everyone to tuning into this episode of The Past Has an Afterlife on hmTv. I'd like to thank my guest, Trevor Stern, for sharing some insights on Jewish student life. If you enjoyed exploring the information, history, and stories in today's conversations, be sure to check out our other episodes and podcasts here on hmTV. Please subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, take care and be well.